A black honors student walked into class, clutching the project he'd spent weeks perfecting. The professor glanced at it once and accused him of stealing it, saying, "Someone like you couldn't have done this." The room froze, classmates staring, waiting for him to break. But what no one knew was that in the next 30 seconds, he would expose a truth that would shatter the entire university. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The chalk screeched against the blackboard, slicing through the silence of the lecture hall like a blade. Professor Andrew Milton, silver-haired and immaculately dressed in his tailored gray suit, drew out the final string of symbols. The equation sprawled across the board like a mural of complexity, numbers, variables, Greek letters and fractal-like notations that seemed to taunt the rows of students staring blankly from their seats. Milton's reputation preceded him, one of the most respected mathematicians in the country, a man whose word carried the weight of gospel within these ivy-clad walls. He set the chalk down with a deliberate flick of his wrist, dust scattering like powdered snow. Then he turned to face the 100 or so students who filled the hall. His eyes scanned the sea of faces, sharp, expectant, but quickly faltering into expressions of dread as they read the impossible equation. "This," Milton announced, his voice heavy with authority, "is an unsolved problem. Mathematicians have wrestled with versions of it for decades. It has stumped minds far sharper than yours." He allowed himself a faint smile, the kind that hovered between pride and cruelty. "You will not solve it, but you will try, because failure is a part of learning." The class shifted uncomfortably. Pens hesitated above notebooks. Some students attempted a brave smirk, but most avoided the board as though it carried a curse. At the far back of the hall, half hidden behind the high shoulders of wealthier students in designer jackets, sat Caleb Richardson, 19 years old, wiry frame, his sweatshirt worn at the elbows, his notebook thin from reuse. Unlike many in the room, he hadn't come to this prestigious university through legacy or donation. He had clawed his way here through scholarships, through late nights of tutoring other kids, through hours hunched over textbooks borrowed from libraries that threatened to close each summer. But none of that was visible to the class. To them, he was just the poor black kid, who somehow slipped through admissions. Caleb's eyes fixed on the board, and a current of recognition sparked in him. The lines, the symbols, the layered logic. It wasn't alien to him. He had seen versions of this in the dense journals he studied on his cracked laptop late at night, when the dormitory hall quieted. Something inside him tightened with urgency. His mind began running through possibilities, reshaping, rearranging, testing patterns. Around him, whispers rose. "That's charity admissions for you," a voice hissed from the row ahead. "Bet he doesn't even get what half those letters mean." "Relax," another muttered. "He won't last past sophomore year. They never do." The words burned, but Caleb didn't flinch. He had heard worse before. He sat straighter, lifted his pen, and began sketching quiet notations in the margins of his notebook. His movements were precise, measured, as though every line written was a step in a dance only he could hear. At the front, Milton paced deliberately, scanning the faces. His eyes landed briefly on Caleb. Something flickered. Dismissal. He did not pause. Instead, he focused his attention on the front row, where students with polished accents and confidence leaned forward as though they were already successors to his throne. "Show me," Milton commanded, pointing to one of them. A tall boy named Parker rose, his navy sweater crisply ironed, his expression groomed for approval. He walked to the board, chalk trembling slightly in his manicured fingers. He wrote a line, hesitated, then another. The class leaned in. Milton nodded once, indulgent. "Good attempt," he said, though the logic fell apart within minutes. Still, Parker returned to his seat with a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Caleb raised his hand. His heart pounded, but his voice was steady. "Professor, I think I—" Milton cut him off without looking. "We'll come back to you later. Anyone else?" The dismissal stung sharper than the whispers. Caleb let his hand drop slowly, his fingers curling into his notebook. Later, he knew what later meant. Never. Other students tried. Each one faltered. Each mistake was greeted with either a gentle correction or a consoling phrase. But when Caleb lifted his hand again, Milton's gaze swept past him like he wasn't there. Subtle bias filled the air like a second atmosphere. The students nearest the front were praised for mere attempts. Those in the middle rows were critiqued, but encouraged. And Caleb, always in the back, was invisible. His voice drowned in silence before it could ever surface. The irony was bitter. This institution prided itself on diversity. Brochures, on glossy photos of smiling students of color posed beneath banners of inclusion. But inside this room, inside this moment, Caleb was reduced to an afterthought. Still, he couldn't stop his mind. The equation unfolded in his head, with every passing second. Patterns emerged where others saw chaos. He scribbled across his notebook furiously, filling lines faster than he could think. The rhythm of problem-solving was intoxicating. It was as though the equation had been waiting for him, daring him to notice what no one else would. From the corner of his eye, he saw two students glance back at him, snickering, one mind snapping a picture. He heard the faint buzz of a phone camera. Caleb pressed his lips together, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Milton returned to the board, crossing out Parker's attempt with a flourish. "This is why you must respect the boundaries of your own abilities," he lectured. "Not every problem is yours to solve." He let the words hang, a quiet sermon meant to humble. Caleb's chest tightened. Respect the boundaries. That phrase was not neutral. It was a warning, disguised as wisdom, aimed squarely at people like him. He had lived his life under invisible boundaries. Neighborhoods he was told never to cross. Opportunities he was told were too high to reach. Classrooms where his presence was tolerated, but never embraced. And yet, he could see the solution. The lines in his notebook screamed it back at him. Each step built on the last with clarity that defied Milton's declaration. The lecture dragged on, students shifting restlessly. The unsolved problem remained untouched, looming at the edge of their understanding. Milton glanced at the clock, then back at the class. Finally, he faced them fully. His voice softened, but with finality. "No one in this room can solve this equation. I promise you that." Gasps, chuckles, a few relieved sighs. The impossible problem was being granted mercy. It was not theirs to bear. But at the back, Caleb Richardson's pulse thundered. His notebook was filled, each line building toward the answer. His hand clenched the pen so tightly it could have broken. He knew. He was certain. And in that certainty, another truth glowed quietly, defiantly. The professor was wrong. The class began to pack up, chatter rising. Milton erased a section of the board as though sealing the challenge away for another generation. But Caleb's eyes stayed fixed on the fading chalk lines. His heart pounded with an unshakable resolve. Because in that instant, he knew something no one else in the room would admit. He could solve it. As Professor Milton declared the problem unsolvable, Caleb's certainty hardened. He could see the answer unfolding before his eyes. The only question was, would he dare to prove the world wrong? The lecture hall emptied. Students spilling into the wide marble corridors with their chatter echoing against the old stone walls. Laughter, casual complaints about assignments, talk of lunch plans, all blended into the careless symphony of privilege. But Caleb stayed behind in his seat, his notebook clutched tightly in his hand. He stared at the fading lines of chalk, still smudged on the board. To anyone else, the symbols looked like a graveyard of complexity. But to him, they pulsed like constellations, waiting to be connected. He could see the path so clearly, it almost frightened him. And yet, he also knew how fragile his position was in this place. One wrong move, one act of defiance, and the university would be quick to remind him, "You don't belong here." As he sat frozen, a memory seeped into his mind, uninvited but unshakable. The smell of fried onions clinging to his mother's uniform, when she came home from the late shift. The sound of her tired keys jingling as she unlocked the door of their cramped apartment. Caleb had been raised by resilience. His mother, Denise Richardson, had carried him through the world with nothing but grit and an unyielding belief that he was meant for more. She worked 2 jobs, day shifts at a diner, nights cleaning offices downtown. Sometimes she would come home so exhausted her legs buckled. But even then she would sit with Caleb at the kitchen table, reviewing his homework by the dim light of a flickering bulb. "You got this, baby," she'd say, rubbing her temples as though fighting back the migraine that never left her. "You keep proving them wrong. Every single day." And he did. From elementary school through high school, Caleb's mind outpaced his teachers. Numbers came to him like breathing. Equations weren't walls. They were doors. But every time he walked through one, someone tried to slam it behind him. In 5th grade, when he solved a math test in half the allotted time with a perfect score, his teacher accused him of copying. "I just don't see how you figured it out so fast," she had said. eyes narrowing as though brilliance and blackness could not coexist. In 8th grade, he entered a regional math contest and scored higher than any student in the competition. The judge, an older man with a stiff tie, had leaned down and whispered, "Be honest, son. Did someone help you with these problems at home?" Caleb had looked him squarely in the eye and replied, "No one at home even understands them." But the doubt never stopped. Teachers double-checked his answers, as if waiting for the mask of genius to slip and reveal fraud underneath. Counselors told him not to set his sights too high, suggesting community college, instead of the scholarships he eventually earned. He remembered one moment with blistering clarity. Sophomore year of high school. His math teacher, Mr. Claremont, stood by the whiteboard, arms crossed, looking at Caleb's correct solution to a calculus problem meant for seniors. The class buzzed in disbelief, and in Claremont said it, words that would etch themselves into Caleb's skin like acid. "Kids like you don't end up in labs. You end up in jail." The room had fallen silent. A few students snickered. Caleb's chest burned, but he swallowed the fury, letting it harden into fuel. That night, at the kitchen table, he buried himself in textbooks until the sun rose. He would not be a statistic. He would not be another story they told to justify their prejudice. Yet even now, years later, sitting in the hallowed halls of one of America's most prestigious universities, those words lingered. They whispered at the back of his mind each time someone overlooked him, each time a professor's eyes slid past him, each time a classmate raised an eyebrow at his presence. Statistical noise. That's all they saw him as. An anomaly that didn't fit their equation of who belonged here. Caleb closed his notebook, running a hand over the worn cover. His scholarship barely covered tuition. Books were bought secondhand or not at all. Meals were skipped more often than he admitted. His dorm room was a single bed with peeling paint and a heater that rattled louder than it worked. Meanwhile, his classmates strolled into lecture in pressed coats, their tuition bills covered by parents whose names carried weight. And yet, despite the gulf between their worlds, none of them could see what he saw on that board. The door creaked, and a student lingered. James Whitaker, a boy with slick blonde hair and a permanent smirk. He leaned against the frame, watching Caleb with narrowed eyes. "You really think you're going to be the one to crack it?" James asked. His tone dipped in mockery. Caleb didn't look up. "I think I understand it." James chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, you're wild. You think you're smarter than Parker? Than Madison? Than all of us?" "I don't think about you," Caleb replied quietly, but with steel. The smirk faltered. James muttered something under his breath and left, the sound of his expensive shoes fading down the hall. Caleb exhaled slowly, gripping his notebook tighter. He wasn't here to prove himself to James or Parker, or even Milton. He was here because his mother had broken her back so he could sit in this very chair. He was here because every sneer, every dismissal, every word of doubt had built a fire in him too hot to extinguish. Still, the fire burned lonely. He packed his bag, heading down the empty hallways. His mind replayed Milton's voice. "No one in this room can solve this." The declaration wasn't just about math. It was about boundaries, about power, about who got to be seen as capable. Caleb paused at the heavy oak doors before stepping into the autumn air outside. Students clustered in groups, laughter rising as leaves crunched underfoot. He walked past them unnoticed, invisible as always. But inside, he carried something invisible no longer. A solution. His memory flickered again to Mr. Claremont's cutting words. "Kids like you don't end up in labs. You end up in jail." Not this kid, Caleb thought. Not me. And yet, as he headed toward his next class, determination buzzing in his chest, he had no idea what was waiting. Because while his resolve grew stronger, Professor Milton was already preparing to humiliate him in front of everyone. Caleb's backstory hardened his resolve to prove himself. But the professor, unwilling to let a poor black student challenge the balance of power, was already plotting his public humiliation. The following morning, the lecture hall buzzed with restless energy. The impossible equation still hung heavy in the air, as though the chalk dust from yesterday had settled into the bones of the room. Students whispered about it, some laughing off the challenge, others pretending not to care, but everyone secretly haunted by the professor's bold declaration. Caleb walked in quietly, slipping once more to his usual seat in the back. He carried his notebook, the pages still filled with last night's scribbles, the outline of the solution etched in his mind like a melody he couldn't stop humming. but he also carried the weight of what he knew was coming. Professor Milton hadn't forgotten the way Caleb had raised his hand. He had seen the flicker of dismissal in the man's eyes. Today would not pass without consequence. Milton entered sharply, carrying himself like a general ready for battle. He didn't waste time with greetings. He turned straight to the board, rewriting the same sprawling symbols, each stroke deliberate, as if daring anyone to contradict him. Yesterday, he began, we saw just how daunting true mathematics can be. Many of you attempted, and many of you failed. But failure is nothing to fear. Failure is growth. His tone was indulgent, almost warm until his gaze swept the room and stopped for a fraction of a second on Caleb. The warmth cooled into stone. Let's continue our exercise. Parker, would you come forward again? The tall, confident student rose with a grin, his sweater pressed, his stride casual. He walked to the front as a few classmates muttered encouragements. Milton handed him the chalk like a ceremonial sword. Parker scrawled a few lines, hesitating, erasing, trying again. His steps faltered quickly, logic collapsing. Snickers rippled in the room, but Milton raised a hand, stopping them. Good effort, the professor said firmly. A mind that dares is a mind that grows. Well done. He patted Parker's shoulder before the boy returned to his seat, relieved and smug. Encouragement for failure. Approval for stumbling. Caleb felt heat rise in his chest. He knew what would happen next. Now, Milton said, scanning the room with a predator's patience. Does anyone else wish to try? The silence stretched. Students glanced at each other nervously, unwilling to risk embarrassment. And then Caleb's hand lifted, steady but heavy with the weight of the moment. A few heads turned. A whisper hissed from the side row. He thinks he can solve it? Another voice. This should be good. Milton's eyes locked on him, expression unreadable. Then, with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes, he said, Well, Mr. Richardson, please enlighten us. The words dripped not with encouragement, but with mockery. Caleb rose, clutching his notebook. He walked slowly down the steps toward the front, every footstep echoing like a drumbeat of judgment. Whispers followed him, laughter muffled behind palms. By the time he reached the board, half the class had their phones out, screens glowing as they prepared to capture what they believed would be a spectacle of failure. Milton handed him the chalk. Mathematics isn't for everyone, son, he said softly, just loud enough for the front rows to hear. But let's see what you think you know. The word son burned like acid. It wasn't affectionate. It was belittling. Caleb held the chalk tightly, the room around him blurring into white noise. He looked at the equation, at the vast tangle of variables that had frightened the others. To him it was clear, logical, beautiful. He took a breath and began. The first line appeared clean, precise. He wrote without hesitation, his strokes sharp and deliberate. Laughter snickered behind him. Overconfident, someone whispered. Wait until he trips. But Caleb didn't trip. His movements were steady, almost musical. He saw the rhythm, the hidden order behind the chaos. His notebook had shown him the way, and now his hand obeyed. Milton crossed his arms, lips curled in faint amusement, as if watching a child play dress-up. Careful now, he muttered, but Caleb ignored him. Another line, and another. The chuckles grew louder, the phones tilted higher. Some zoomed in, eager to capture the moment his logic collapsed. A few students exchanged bets under their breath. But then, something shifted. The numbers began to align in a way that silenced even the most cynical observers. Patterns emerged where none had been expected. His steps weren't guesses. They were deliberate, flowing naturally into one another. The smirks faltered. The laughter thinned. The sound of chalk against the board filled the room, fast and sure. Caleb's shoulders were squared, his jaw set, his eyes burning with clarity. One more line. The class leaned forward, their earlier amusement melting into disbelief. The equation, once sprawling, monstrous, untouchable, was bending beneath his hand. Phones that had been lifted to capture humiliation were now trembling as their owners realized something unexpected was happening. The laughter stopped altogether. And then, as Caleb wrote the next line, the room went utterly silent. Something was different. The lecture hall, once buzzing with ridicule, froze into silence as Caleb's solution unfolded on the board. For the first time, they realized he wasn't stumbling. He was reshaping the impossible. The chalk moved quickly, guided not by hesitation but by certainty. Caleb's strokes were crisp, purposeful, deliberate. Each number, each variable connected like pieces of a puzzle that had always been meant to fit together. The room, once alive with mockery and buzzing whispers, was so still that even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder. At first the students leaned forward for entertainment, eager to see the inevitable collapse. But as the lines grew, something unexpected filled the space coherent. The equation, which had sprawled like an unsolvable jungle of complexity, was being tamed. Step by step, Caleb carved a path through it, a route no one else had dared to imagine. His logic wasn't a series of lucky guesses. It was a symphony, each note falling exactly where it belonged. Shock rippled across the rows. A girl in the front, Madison, lowered her phone mid-recording, her eyebrows pulling tight. Parker, arms crossed in smug confidence moments ago, now leaned forward with genuine disbelief. Even the students who had mocked him yesterday, James among them, watched with wide eyes, their mouths slightly open. The silence carried its own electricity. But at the front, Professor Milton stiffened. His arms tightened across his chest. His jaw clenched. He had expected failure, laughter, another moment to remind the class where authority resided. Instead, he saw something dangerous unfolding. Truth. Milton's mind spun. This boy can't actually be doing it. Not him. Caleb's hand never faltered. His mind moved faster than the chalk could keep pace. Every connection felt inevitable. Every transformation of the equation, another nail in the coffin of impossibility. Whispers began to rise again. But this time they were different. Wait, he's right. Look at that step. That's actually valid.
No way. No way.
Milton stepped forward sharply, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. His voice cut into the growing awe like a blade. Stop, he said, reaching past Caleb. With a quick sweep, he erased part of the equation. The chalk dust smeared under his palm, leaving a jagged scar through Caleb's work. Coincidence, Milton announced, his tone icy but controlled. A coincidence, not genius. You can mimic fragments without understanding the whole. Gasps fluttered through the lecture hall. Students exchanged looks, some confused, some uncomfortable. Caleb froze, the chalk still in his hand. For a moment, silence pressed heavy against him. Then slowly, he turned to face Milton. Their eyes met, youth against authority, vulnerability against pride. Caleb's voice was steady, quiet but carrying to the back row. You made a mistake, Professor. The words cracked the room open, like lightning splitting the sky. A sharp intake of breath echoed from the class. Madison's jaw dropped. Parker muttered, "Did he just?" Phones lifted higher, trembling slightly, as their owners realized what they were capturing. This wasn't just a poor scholarship student struggling against an equation. This was confrontation. This was defiance. Milton blinked, momentarily thrown. Excuse me? Caleb set the chalk back against the board, circling one of the lines Milton had erased. Here, he said firmly. You assumed the transformation wasn't valid, but it is, if you follow it. He quickly rewrote the steps Milton had destroyed, his strokes sharper now, bolder, unafraid. You see the symmetry. You missed it. The students leaned forward, as if pulled by gravity. The logic was clear. Even those who had no grasp of the math could sense the inevitability of it in Caleb's calm explanation. Milton's face flushed. His grip on authority felt suddenly fragile, cracking beneath the weight of truth unfolding before him. This isn't your place to challenge me, Milton snapped. Mathematics requires discipline, maturity, and years of training. You think you've discovered something? You haven't. You're parroting. But the words didn't land as they used to. For once the class didn't laugh with him. They didn't smirk at Caleb's expense. They stared between the professor and the student, watching a balance of power shift right in front of them. Caleb turned slowly, meeting the eyes of his classmates. His chest tightened with the weight of the moment, but his voice remained calm. I see the equation, he said simply. And it's not coincidence. He turned back to the board, ignoring Milton's glare, and added the next step. The line fell into place perfectly. The silence in the room deepened into awe. It was undeniable now. The boy in the back row, the student who was meant to fail, the scholarship kid no one believed in, was bending the impossible into something solvable. The chains of dismissal, of invisibility, of doubt, each stroke of chalk broke them further. And yet, behind him, Milton's eyes burned with something darker than disbelief. They burned with fear. Caleb's correction of Milton's mistake hung in the air like a spark over dry leaves. The class gasped, stunned into silence, as the unthinkable settled in. Caleb Richardson might actually succeed against the professor himself. The chalk scraped again, steady, unrelenting. Caleb's hand moved as if guided by something beyond him, his logic flowing faster than the murmurs rippling through the class. The erased lines Milton had tried to blot out now reappeared, stronger, cleaner, impossible to dismiss. The professor's jaw tightened. He had built his entire career on control, on being the authority, the voice no student dared to contradict. But now, here in front of a room full of witnesses, the scaffolding of that authority trembled. Milton's pride wrestled with something deeper, something more poisonous. He wasn't just watching a student succeed where others had failed. He was watching Caleb succeed. A boy from the scholarship list. A boy from the margin. A boy whose presence in the back row was supposed to be symbolic, not substantial. And that truth pressed down on him like a weight he couldn't bear. Enough, Milton snapped, his voice slicing the silence. You don't know what you're doing. But Caleb didn't flinch. His strokes grew sharper, faster. Each new step aligned with the last, the structure of the proof expanding like a cathedral, taking shape, stone by stone. His notebook lay open on the desk behind him, filled with the same progression. It was real. It was his. Whispers swirled in the room. He's right. Look at that. That's not random. Oh my God, he's actually doing it. The weight of the murmurs made Milton's skin crawl. He stepped closer, looming behind Caleb like a shadow trying to smother light. You must have found this online, Milton accused, his tone dripping with disdain. Some obscure forum, some corner of the internet, where others have attempted fragments. This isn't your work. Caleb paused, his back straightening. Slowly, he turned his head to meet Milton's glare. His eyes were calm, but beneath that calm lay years of swallowing doubt, years of being underestimated, years of rage disguised as restraint. I'm not copying, Caleb said evenly. I'm thinking, right here, right now. You can't fake that. He tapped the chalk against the board once, then pointed to the last line he'd written. If I'd memorized this, I wouldn't be able to explain why this transformation works. But I can. Do you want me to? Milton's lips pressed into a thin line, but before he could speak, Caleb continued. This line, Caleb explained, underlining the step, isn't guesswork. It's symmetry. The equation folds in on itself if you recognize the hidden balance. That's why it simplifies like this. Watch. He wrote the next transformation, with crisp precision. The air thickened with disbelief as the equation narrowed further. The whispers grew louder. Students leaned forward, their skepticism dissolving into awe. Phones that had been raised for ridicule were now recording something historic. He's right. Every step makes sense. Where did he even learn this? This is insane. For the first time in years of teaching, Milton felt the attention of the room slip from his grasp. The authority that had always clung to his every word now drifted toward Caleb, toward the student who was dismantling not just the equation, but the unspoken hierarchy Milton had built his classroom upon. It wasn't only mathematics at stake. It was power. Coincidence? Milton tried again, his voice sharp, defensive. You've stumbled into a path others abandoned because it led nowhere. Just because it looks convincing doesn't make it true. But his words rang hollow. Even those unfamiliar with advanced theory could see the inevitability in Caleb's work. Then test it, Caleb replied, his tone firm but never raised. You're the one who told us math doesn't lie, so let's not lie about what's on the board. Gasps flickered again. Caleb wasn't shouting. He wasn't grandstanding. He was simply standing his ground. Milton's pride roared inside him, but outwardly he forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. Careful, son. Pride comes before a fall. The irony wasn't lost on the class. Some smirked. Others exchanged knowing glances. For the first time, the professor looked small. But Caleb wasn't finished. His hand moved again, chalk racing across the board. The equation shrank, simplifying, revealing its hidden order. Each stroke was another crack in the wall that had kept him invisible. Each step was a defiance not just of mathematical impossibility, but of every whispered doubt, every raised eyebrow, every kids like you don't belong here. And then it happened. The impossible equation, the one Milton had sworn no one in the room could solve, now stood one line away from resolution. The class collectively leaned in, breathless. Even the most dismissive students felt their stomachs tighten, realizing they were on the verge of witnessing history. Caleb paused, the chalk trembling slightly between his fingers. Not from fear, but from the enormity of the moment, pressing down on him. His mother's tired face flashed in his mind, her words whispering, "You keep proving them wrong." The board was nearly complete. But as the silence thickened, one truth lingered heavy in the room. If Caleb wrote that final line, it wouldn't just change the equation. It would expose every unspoken prejudice, every false assumption that had shackled him since the day he walked into this classroom. And Milton knew it. The impossible equation now stood one line away from solved. Caleb raised the chalk, ready to finish, but the professor's pride and prejudice were about to collide in one final attempt to stop him. The chalk hovered just above the board. Caleb's fingers tightened around it, his chest rising and falling in rhythm, with the weight of the room pressing against him, 100 eyes fixed on him, waiting for collapse, praying for spectacle, or bracing for something no one had expected. And then, with a single breath, he wrote the final line. The symbols fell into place, clean and undeniable. The equation, sprawling and monstrous only yesterday, now stood simplified, resolved, conquered. The silence was deafening. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the faint tapping of pens, the shifting of notebooks, the shallow coughs that usually filled the air of a lecture hall, gone. The weight of the solved equation pressed down on everyone like a revelation they weren't prepared to carry. Caleb set the chalk down gently on the ledge beneath the board. He didn't turn immediately. His eyes stayed on the solution, a strange mix of relief and defiance swirling inside him. He hadn't just solved a problem. He had broken chains, visible and invisible. Finally, he turned. The room stared back at him. One student clapped. It was quiet, hesitant, awkward. The sound of skin against skin felt almost intrusive in the stillness. Another joined. Then another. But the applause was fractured, half-hearted, uncertain, as though acknowledging Caleb's brilliance was dangerous in itself. Others didn't move at all. They stayed frozen in their seats, their faces stiff, their eyes darting between the professor and the student who had just rewritten the impossible. And Milton looked pale. His skin, usually flushed with confidence, had drained of color. His hands were clenched so tightly the knuckles gleamed white. The foundation of his authority, carefully laid over years of lectures, prestige, and untouchable expertise, had cracked before his eyes. But instead of crumbling, he lashed out. "Even broken clocks are right twice a day," Milton said, his voice sharp, brittle, desperate to regain ground. The words cut through the room like ice water. The clapping stopped instantly. Students shifted in their seats, discomfort heavy in the air. Some looked down at their notebooks, others at the floor. A few exchanged glances, wide-eyed as though wondering if they had just witnessed the professor flinch. Caleb stood still, his expression unreadable. Inside, anger simmered, but he swallowed it. He had learned long ago that outrage only fed their prejudice, only confirmed what they wanted to believe. Instead, he let the silence hang, let Milton's words echo hollowly in the air, because the truth was already written on the board, and it could not be erased. Milton turned his back, snatching the chalk and scribbling nonsense equations beside Caleb's work, his movements frantic, as though burying the proof beneath a storm of symbols. "This isn't conclusive. It doesn't meet peer-reviewed standards. It does." But his voice faltered. Everyone could see it. Everyone knew. In the back row, a phone stayed lifted. The screen glowed, recording. James Whitaker, one of the loudest doubters yesterday, held it steady. But his usual smirk was gone. His eyes were wide, focused, as if realizing that this wasn't just classroom drama. This was something bigger, something the world needed to see. He zoomed in, capturing every detail. The finished solution, the professor's dismissal, the faces of classmates caught between disbelief and complicity. The whisper of a thought ran through James's mind, foreign but insistent. If this goes online, people will know. People will see what really happened. Caleb gathered his notebook slowly, each movement deliberate. He didn't look at Milton. He didn't need to. The board behind him spoke louder than anything he could say. But the room wasn't ready to applaud him, not openly. Applause meant acknowledgement. Acknowledgement meant admitting their bias, and bias was easier to bury than confront. So they stayed silent, except James, whose thumb hovered over the upload button. He hesitated. His parents were donors, his professors allies of Milton, his circle filled with the privilege that kept him insulated from consequences. But as he looked again at the equation, flawless and undeniable, He realized silence would make him complicit. He pressed the button. Video uploaded.
No one noticed yet.
At the front, Milton cleared his throat, still scribbling distractions across the board. That will be all for today, he said curtly. Dismissed. Chairs scraped against the floor. Students shuffled out, their whispers a tangled mess of awe, confusion and fear. Some stole glances at Caleb. Some avoided his eyes altogether. No one spoke to him. No one congratulated him. Caleb walked out last, his notebook against his chest, his face calm but his heart pounding. He knew what had happened in that room, knew what Milton had tried to erase, but he didn't yet know that outside these walls, the world was about to see everything. As Caleb left the lecture hall in silence, unaware of the video spreading online, James's upload began racing across social media, about to turn a classroom humiliation into a national reckoning. By the time Caleb walked back to his dorm that afternoon, the air had shifted. He didn't notice it immediately. He was too consumed with the silence of the lecture hall, still echoing in his ears, too weighed down by Milton's words, cutting away at his triumph. To him, the moment had ended in humiliation, the equation smothered under denial. But outside the walls of the university, the story was already breaking free. James's video, shaky but clear, captured everything. Caleb solving the impossible equation, Milton's dismissive interruption, the final line on the board, and the professor's cutting remark, even broken clocks are right twice a day. It uploaded quietly at first, just another clip in the endless scroll of content. But within minutes, it began to move. Retweets, duets, hashtags. By evening it had ignited. On TikTok the clip looped endlessly with captions flashing across the screen. They tried to silence him. When genius is ignored because of skin color, let Caleb speak. Black genius. On Twitter threads dissected each frame. Mathematicians chimed in, confirming that Caleb's proof looked not only correct but groundbreaking. Others focused on Milton's words, replaying them with outrage, calling out the casual racism of dismissing brilliance as coincidence. Millions watched. Millions debated, but not all voices celebrated. The trolls arrived swiftly, as they always did. He probably cheated. Bet some grad student fed him the answer. Affirmative action at work. Without handouts he wouldn't even be in that room. Anonymous accounts flooded the comments with venom, their avatars faceless but their hatred loud. Beneath every post praising Caleb, replies festered with doubt, mockery, and racial slurs. Caleb, sitting alone at his desk, hadn't even opened his phone yet. He was sketching equations in his notebook, trying to anchor himself in something familiar. But his notifications pulsed endlessly, his screen lighting up every few seconds. When he finally glanced at it, his breath caught. Thousands of mentions. His name everywhere. Videos stitched with his face. Screenshots of the equation. Headlines already forming. He scrolled slowly, disbelieving. A stranger had written, "This young man deserves a full scholarship for life. Protect him at all costs." Another, "I've been teaching math for 20 years. What he did is extraordinary." His heart thudded. He wasn't invisible anymore. But visibility felt like standing in a spotlight with nowhere to hide. Down the hall, voices echoed. Other students in his dorm were already talking. "You see that video? That's Caleb." "No way. I've got class with him." "Dude's like, quiet as hell. Didn't think he had that in him." "I heard Milton tried to shut him down." "Figures." Caleb shut his door, locking it, pressing his back against the wood. His room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. He wasn't ready for this. He'd never asked for it. But the world wasn't waiting for his permission. By morning, the story had broken into national media. News anchors replayed the clip with somber voices. A viral video raises questions of racial bias at one of the nation's top universities. Commentators debated whether Milton's dismissal was prejudice or professional skepticism. Hashtags surged across platforms, let Caleb spit climbing into global trends. Some demanded justice. Some demanded proof. Everyone demanded more. The phone in Caleb's room rang, a landline he rarely used. He froze, staring at it until the ringing cut through his thoughts. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Richardson?" The voice was brisk, professional. "This is Jennifer from the New York Times. We'd like a comment about the incident yesterday. Millions are following this story. Do you have a moment?" Caleb's throat went dry. I don't want to comment." But the calls didn't stop. Emails flooded in. Journalists camped outside the university gates. Students began approaching him in the cafeteria, their phones out, their eyes wide with curiosity. Some offered congratulations. Others just wanted content. He couldn't eat without whispers surrounding him. Couldn't walk across campus without feeling every pair of eyes. His mother called one evening, her voice trembling with both pride and fear. "Baby, they're talking about you on the news. Do you know what that means?" Caleb sank into his bed, pressing the phone to his ear. "It means they're going to come for me, Mom. They already are." "No," she said firmly. "It means you did what they told you you couldn't. Don't let them twist that away." Her words steadied him, but only for a moment. Because as quickly as praise came, so did the backlash. Anonymous threats slipped into his inbox. "Stay in your lane. You'll regret this." His scholarship email account overflowed with hate messages from strangers claiming he didn't deserve his place. The duality of it all tore at him. Celebrated as a genius, reduced to a target. Meanwhile, the university administration scrambled. Reporters demanded statements. Alumni donors called, concerned about reputational damage. Milton issued no comment, retreating behind closed doors, but his silence only fueled the fire. It was inevitable. A call came. "Mr. Richardson," the voice on the other end said stiffly, "the dean would like to see you." "A closed meeting. Tomorrow morning." The line went dead before Caleb could respond. He sat frozen in his room, the glow of his laptop illuminating the hashtag still climbing, the comments still multiplying. He had solved an equation, but in doing so, he had unleashed something far more volatile, a public reckoning. And now, the very institution that had doubted him from the start was summoning him behind closed doors. Caleb's phone slipped from his hand as the dean's summons echoed in his ears. The university wanted silence, control, but Caleb had already become something they couldn't contain. The dean's office was nothing like the lecture halls or dorms Caleb had grown used to. It smelled of old wood and polish, its walls lined with books that looked untouched, more decoration than knowledge. Heavy curtains dimmed the morning light, giving the room a suffocating feel, as though sunlight itself wasn't allowed in. Caleb sat in the center of a long mahogany table, his hands folded tight to keep them from trembling. Across from him sat 5 members of the academic panel, each with folders stacked neatly in front of them. Their faces bore the polished calm of authority, but their eyes carried something harsher, judgment already past. At the head of the table, Dean Harland adjusted his glasses, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Richardson," he began, "you understand why you've been called here." Caleb swallowed. His voice, though quiet, didn't waver. "Because of the equation." A professor with thin gray hair leaned forward. "Because of the video," she corrected. "It has drawn unnecessary attention to this institution. An attention we cannot control is dangerous." The word landed heavy. Dangerous. Not the racism, not the professor's dismissal, not the brilliance captured in that moment. The danger, to them, was exposure. Another panelist, Professor O'Donnell, tapped his pen against the folder. "We've reviewed your academic history. Impressive grades. Yes, but nothing to suggest capability at the level demonstrated on that board. Naturally, questions have arisen." "Questions," Caleb repeated, his eyes narrowing. "Or accusations." The dean's lips tightened. "We must protect the reputation of this university. If someone were to think you had," he paused delicately, choosing his words like scalpels, "borrowed this solution from an outside source, it would cast doubt on our academic standards." Caleb leaned forward, his voice firmer now. "I didn't borrow it. I didn't cheat. I worked through it myself, in real time, in front of everyone." The gray-haired professor raised a brow. "That's precisely what we'd like you to prove. Again, here, now." The demand sat heavy in the room. Caleb's chest tightened. He had nothing to hide, but the way they framed it wasn't about truth. It was about control. A test, not to confirm his brilliance, but to corner him into failing under their conditions. "I don't think this is fair," Caleb said carefully. If you were anyone else," O'Donnell interrupted, "we wouldn't be here, at all. But you are, and we are. So prove it." Caleb's jaw clenched. He wanted to shout, remind them that professors had once accused him of cheating on simple tests, because they couldn't reconcile his mind with his skin. He wanted to tell them that the proof was already on the board, recorded, undeniable, but he saw the trap in their eyes. This wasn't about evidence. This was about breaking him. And then the twist of the knife. "You will not require legal representation for this inquiry. Dean Harlan said flatly. It is an academic matter, not a legal one. The words sent a chill down Caleb's spine. No protection. No advocate. Just him against the system. He glanced at the door. He knew his mother was outside, waiting, her hands probably clasped together, whispering prayers into the silence of the hallway. The image both steadied him and tore him apart. She had sacrificed everything to put him here, and now these walls were trying to undo it. The gray-haired professor slid a blank sheet of paper across the table, along with a pen. Solve it, she said simply. Any problem we assign you. If you're as capable as the internet believes, this should be easy. Caleb stared at the paper. It wasn't the challenge that frightened him. It was the principle. No other student would be asked to prove their intelligence like this. No one else would be dragged before a panel for succeeding. He set the pen down deliberately. This isn't about math, he said quietly. This is about me. The room stiffened. O'Donnell's lips curled. Careful, Mr. Richardson. Playing the victim won't help you here. Caleb met his gaze, unwavering. I'm not playing. I've been living it. The silence that followed was sharp, almost violent. The panelists shifted in their seats, discomfort flickering across their faces. But none of them spoke up. Finally, Dean Harlan broke the tension. His voice was colder now. Mr. Richardson, unless you cooperate, we will have no choice but to pursue disciplinary action. Allegations of academic dishonesty can result in suspension or expulsion. The word hung in the air like a gavel strike. Expulsion. Caleb's stomach dropped, but he forced his face to remain steady. He thought of his mother, sitting just feet away, thinking her son was fighting for recognition, when in truth he was fighting for survival. He thought of the millions of strangers chanting his name online, blind to the fact that behind closed doors, the same system that applauded diversity in brochures was sharpening its knives against him. This wasn't a test of mathematics. It was a test of submission. And Caleb realized with painful clarity, the system wasn't designed to celebrate his brilliance. It was designed to crush it. Dean Harlan leaned forward, his tone final, merciless. Unless you admit that you misrepresented your work, unless you confess to dishonesty, this university will move forward with expulsion proceedings. Do you understand? Caleb's hands tightened around the edge of the table. The polished wood bit into his palms, grounding him in the reality of the threat. His throat burned, his chest heavy with the weight of the ultimatum. Confess to a lie or lose everything. Caleb's breath caught, as the panel's words settled over him. Expulsion, unless he confessed. The walls around him seemed to close in. The door just steps away where his mother prayed, locked against him. The weight of the word expulsion lingered in the air, heavy and final, like a sentence already carved in stone. Caleb felt his pulse in his throat. Every beat a reminder of the line they wanted him to cross, surrender or sacrifice. But he didn't move. He didn't pick up the pen. He didn't bow his head. Instead, he looked each panelist in the eye, one by one, his silence stretching long enough to make them shift in their seats. Finally, his voice broke through the stillness. Calm, steady, unflinching. You would never ask this, he said, if my skin were different. The words landed like a gunshot. The room froze. The panelists who had sat upright in superiority suddenly stiffened with discomfort. A few avoided his gaze, their eyes darting down to their folders, as though the grain of the paper might shield them from the truth. Professor O'Donnell's pen stilled mid-tap. His jaw tightened, but his lips didn't move. The gray-haired professor inhaled sharply, as if preparing to speak, but no words came. Her throat worked, her composure cracked for just a moment. And Dean Harlan, the one who had spoken with icy finality only minutes before, pressed his glasses against the bridge of his nose and exhaled slowly, like a man trying to compose himself. But his eyes betrayed something, not guilt, not regret, but irritation that Caleb had dared to name what they had all tried to disguise. This isn't about race, Harlan said finally, his tone clipped defensive. It's about academic integrity. Caleb leaned forward, his hands steady on the table now. If Parker had solved that problem, you'd be celebrating him. You'd be sending out press releases about the genius your institution fostered. But because it was me, because it was this face, this skin, you drag me in here like a criminal. His words rang in the room, undeniable. No one corrected him. No one dared. The silence itself was admission. Outside the door, Caleb imagined his mother, still sitting with her hands clasped, whispering prayers into the waiting air. He thought of her sacrifices, of the hours she had bent her body to exhaustion so he could sit in this very chair. He thought of the video seen by millions, of strangers online calling him a symbol, a genius, a hero, and here in this dark paneled room, they tried to erase all of it with a single accusation. He would not let them. Expulsion? Caleb said, his voice lower now, heavier. If that's the cost of telling the truth, then so be it. But don't call it integrity. Call it what it is, fear. The panelists exchanged glances, the weight of his words breaking the practiced rhythm of their authority. For once, they didn't look like untouchable gatekeepers. They looked human, fallible, cornered. But Harlan's face hardened. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. You're making a mistake, Mr. Richardson. Caleb met his gaze. No, I'm exposing one. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of authority. It was the silence of guilt. And in that silence, the door cracked open. A voice whispered from the hallway. His mother's voice, soft but firm, praying, Lord, don't let them take my boy. The words slipped into the room, uninvited, undeniable. For a moment, the panelists froze, the sound pulling back the curtain of procedure to reveal the raw humanity outside it. But Harlan closed the file in front of him with a snap. This meeting is adjourned. We will deliberate further and inform you of our decision. Caleb stood, his legs steady though his heart thundered. He opened the door to find his mother rising quickly, clutching her purse with trembling hands. She searched his face for answers, but he only shook his head. They're not listening, he whispered, her lips pressed together, eyes wet but fierce. Then we'll make them. They left the building together, their footsteps echoing through the marble halls. But what they didn't know, what the panel didn't know, was that silence behind closed doors rarely stayed closed. Word leaked. A student journalist, tipped off by whispers from a sympathetic faculty assistant, published an article in the campus paper. The headline was bold, impossible to ignore. Black student who solved impossible equation faces expulsion threat behind closed doors. The story spread like wildfire across campus, then across Twitter, then into mainstream outlets already hungry for updates. The details were damning. A secret panel, accusations of cheating, demands that Caleb prove himself again. The denial of legal representation. The narrative shifted. What had begun as a story of a viral math genius now swelled into something larger, a story of systemic injustice, of institutions desperate to silence the very brilliance they should be celebrating. Caleb's inbox overflowed. Messages of support poured in, louder and stronger than before. Students he'd never spoken to reached out with solidarity, offering to organize protests, to demand transparency. Hashtags multiplied. And then something unexpected. An email appeared in his account from a name he didn't recognize. The subject line was short, urgent. I want to help. The sender, Marcus Holloway, a nationally known civil rights lawyer. The message, I've read what happened. I've seen the video. What they are doing is not only unethical, it may be unlawful. You are not alone. If you're willing, I will represent you. Caleb stared at the screen, his hands trembling now for the first time that day. This wasn't just student journalists or hashtags. This was bigger. The system had tried to silence him, but the world outside was listening louder than they ever anticipated. As Caleb read Marcus Holloway's email offering to take his case, he realized the fight was no longer just between him and a professor. It was about to become a national battle. The next morning, Caleb woke not to the quiet hum of his alarm clock, but to the roar of voices outside his dorm window. He pulled back the blinds, and his chest tightened. Hundreds of students were gathered on the quad, their chants rising like thunder. Cardboard signs bobbed in the air. Justice for Caleb. Stop silencing black genius. Knowledge has no color. The crowd grew by the hour. What had begun as murmurs online had spilled into the physical world, unstoppable and loud. Students who had once walked past him without notice now marched with his name painted across banners. Their voices filled the campus, carrying a demand that could no longer be contained. Caleb stepped back from the window, his pulse racing. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted to be a symbol. All he wanted was to learn, to prove himself through the work. But the world had decided otherwise. A knock rattled his door. It was Marcus Holloway, the civil rights lawyer whose email had landed in Caleb's inbox the night before. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, Marcus carried himself like a man used to walking into fire. They're here for you, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. And you need to understand, This isn't just about an equation anymore. You've become the face of something much bigger. Caleb swallowed. But I never asked. Symbols don't get to ask, Marcus interrupted gently. They get chosen. And now you have to decide how you'll carry it. The weight of those words sank into Caleb like stones. By noon, the protest had swelled. News crews swarmed the gates, their cameras rolling as students poured into the streets, blocking intersections, chanting louder. Hashtags that had begun online were now painted on sidewalks and plastered across social media feeds in real time. Journalists shouted questions when Caleb finally emerged, flanked by Marcus and his mother. Caleb, did the panel threaten to expel you? Do you believe this was racially motivated? How does it feel to be compared to historical figures who broke barriers in science and academia? The questions blurred together, a storm of noise. Caleb kept his head down, his mother's hand on his shoulder, Marcus shielding him with a presence that cut through the chaos. Inside the administration building, Dean Harlan peered through his blinds at the growing sea of protesters. His face was tight, his jaw clenched. "This is getting out of control," he muttered to Milton, who sat stiffly in the chair across from him. Milton adjusted his tie, his eyes dark with anger. "It wouldn't have gone this far if you'd acted decisively. Expel him quietly, before it spread." Harlan snapped. "Expel him now and it'll be blood in the water. Every outlet in the country will crucify us." Milton leaned forward. "Then we discredit him, expose him for what he really is." Harlan frowned. "And what exactly is that, Professor?" Milton's lips curled. "Not a genius, not a prodigy, just another boy from the wrong side of town with a record." Harlan hesitated. "A record?" Milton's eyes gleamed. "Leave it to me." Outside, Caleb struggled to navigate the tidal wave of attention. Students reached for him, calling his name. Some wept openly, telling him he had given them hope. Others begged for interviews, selfies, sound bites. He wanted to disappear. In the quiet of his dorm room that night, he sat with Marcus and his mother, the television flickering with live coverage of the protests. Reporters spoke his name, like it carried the weight of history. "I didn't sign up for this," Caleb whispered. His mother took his hand. "Baby, you were born into this. Whether you asked for it or not, you're showing the world what I've always known, that your mind is a gift." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes steady. "But you need to understand, they won't stop coming for you. They'll dig, they'll smear, they'll try to drag your name through the mud. They've already started making calls." Caleb's stomach sank. "What do you mean?" Marcus exhaled. "Your professor, Milton. He's not taking this lying down. Men like him never do. He'll look for anything, to make you small again." Caleb nodded slowly, the truth pressing on him like a weight he couldn't shake. He thought of the panel, of the silence that followed his words, of Harlan's face behind the desk. They weren't going to let him walk free. Not without a fight. And then, far across campus, in the quiet of his office, Milton scrolled through old databases. His fingers moved with precision, his eyes cold with determination. He wasn't searching for mathematical proofs or scholarly articles. He was searching for Caleb's past. The screen lit up with files long buried but never erased, juvenile records sealed to most but not beyond reach for someone who knew where to look. And there it was, buried in the archives, a petty offense, years old from middle school. Milton leaned back in his chair, a slow smile curving his lips. "This," he whispered to himself, "will be the end of your genius." As chants of justice for Caleb thundered outside, Milton sat alone in his office staring at Caleb's juvenile record glowing on his screen. His plan to destroy Caleb's credibility had just begun. The protests raged on for days, louder and larger each morning. Caleb had become more than a student. He was a headline, a symbol, a movement. But while chants of justice for Caleb filled the campus, Professor Milton sat quietly in his office, smiling at the file glowing on his computer screen. It was small, really. A single page, a juvenile record from nearly a decade ago. Caleb Richardson, age 12. Offense: petty theft. Item stolen: 2 cans of soup and a loaf of bread. Milton leaned back, satisfied. He didn't need brilliance to win this battle. He only needed a stain, and he had found one. The leak was subtle at first. A whisper to a reporter at a conservative blog. A forwarded file to a contact in local media. Within 24 hours, the story broke. "Is this your genius? Rising star's juvenile record exposed. Prodigy or pretender?" Caleb Richardson's past raises questions. Headlines spread like wildfire, twisting fact into weapon. The narrative shifted overnight from math brilliance to moral suspicion. Talk shows debated it with a smug cruelty. He stole food, one commentator said, lips curling. If he was willing to cheat then, who's to say he didn't cheat now? On Twitter, trolls flooded back, louder than before. Fraud. Thief. Figures. Another criminal in the making. Caleb read the headlines in silence, his phone buzzing endlessly with alerts. His chest felt hollow, his stomach heavy, as though all the air had been sucked from his body. He remembered it vividly, the night everything unraveled when he was 12. His mother had been working double shifts, her pay barely enough to cover rent. Their fridge had been almost empty. Just a carton of milk gone sour and a bruised apple rolling in the corner. Caleb had walked into the corner store, his stomach growling, his pockets empty. He hadn't wanted to do it, but hunger overpowered fear. He slipped the bread and cans into his jacket, heart pounding, praying no one saw. But the clerk did. The police were called. A night at the station. His mother's tears when she arrived. The shame of being treated like a criminal before he was even a teenager. The record sealed, or so he'd thought. Now the world knew. He sat in his dorm room, his notebook untouched, his phone a storm of noise. For the first time since the equation, he felt small again. Reduced. Exposed. A knock came. His mother stepped in, her face lined with worry, but her eyes burning with love. She sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. They're talking about it, Caleb said quietly, staring at the floor. About me. About what I did. His mother squeezed his hand. You were 12. It doesn't matter, Caleb whispered. All they see is another black boy stealing. They don't care why. They don't care what it meant. She lifted his chin, forcing him to meet her gaze. Her voice trembled, but it carried steel. Listen to me, Caleb. They only dig because you're shining. If you were nothing, they'd leave you buried. But you're not nothing. You're everything they fear, and that's why they'll do anything to drag you down. Tears stung Caleb's eyes, but he blinked them back. He wanted to believe her, but the voices online were louder than hers, louder than his own. Marcus Holloway stormed in minutes later, his phone buzzing with updates. We expected this, he said, pacing the room. They always do it. When they can't beat your mind, they dig into your past. Doesn't matter if it was 10 years ago. Doesn't matter if you were a child. They'll twist it until people forget the equation ever existed. Caleb shook his head. It's working. People are calling me a fraud, a thief. Marcus stopped pacing, his voice sharp. Then we fight back. You don't run from this, Caleb. You own it. You tell the truth before they bury you with their lies. But Caleb wasn't sure the truth mattered anymore. That evening, the news cycle shifted again. A major network announced a special segment, a live televised debate. The headline blared across the screen. Professor versus Prodigy, the equation, the truth, and the scandal. Milton had agreed to appear, and so had Caleb, though he hadn't known until Marcus showed him the email. You don't have to do this, Marcus said cautiously, watching Caleb read the invitation. It's a setup. They'll try to rattle you, to corner you in front of the entire country. Caleb stared at the screen. His hands trembled, but not from fear, from something else. Resolve. They want to see if I'll break, he said quietly. But I won't. As Caleb agreed to face Milton live on national television, a question loomed heavy. Could he withstand the trial not of mathematics, but of public judgment, where brilliance wasn't enough to erase the stain of his past? The studio lights blazed hot, brighter than anything Caleb had ever known. They bathed the stage in a merciless glow, catching every detail, the nervous flick of a hand, the twitch of an eye, the faintest tremor in a voice. Across from him, Professor Andrew Milton sat stiff-backed, his gray suit immaculate, his file practiced and smug. The network had spared no expense. Cameras swept in wide arcs, capturing the stage from every angle. A massive audience filled the auditorium. Rows of eager faces waiting for spectacle. Millions more were tuned in across the country, their eyes locked on screens, waiting to see the genius prodigy clash with the respected professor. To Milton, this was his redemption. To Caleb, it was his trial. The host, a polished anchor with perfect hair and a voice built for authority, welcomed the nation. Tonight, we bring you a conversation that has captured the attention of millions. The equation, the controversy, and the future of one young man's place in academia. Milton leaned forward, his smile widening as the host turned to him. Professor Milton, you've taught mathematics for decades. What is your take on this young man's sudden fame? Milton cleared his throat, his voice steady, dripping with condescension. With all due respect to Mr. Richardson, mathematics is not solved in viral clips. It is proven through rigor, peer review, and years of disciplined study. One flashy performance does not make a mathematician. The audience murmured, some nodding, others frowning. Milton basked in the sound. The host turned to Caleb. And Caleb, what do you say to those who claim your solution was a fluke, or worse, that it was not your own? Caleb's hands rested in his lap, his posture calm. His mother's words echoed in his mind. They only dig because you're shining. Marcus's voice layered on top. Symbols don't get to ask, they get chosen. He lifted his gaze, steady and unshaken. Math doesn't care about skin color, or background, or who has the fanciest title. The numbers don't lie. People do. The audience erupted. Cheers, gasps, applause tangled together. Milton's smile faltered for the first time. The host pressed forward. Professor Milton, you brought something for tonight, didn't you? A test? Milton straightened. Indeed. To prove once and for all whether this young man's so-called genius holds up under scrutiny. He rose from his chair, walking to the large board set up center stage. He uncapped a marker and began scrawling an equation even more elaborate than the one from the lecture hall. Symbols sprawled across the board like a maze designed to entrap. He stepped back, gesturing grandly. This, he announced, is unsolved by any of your peers. If Mr. Richardson is truly what people claim, he will solve it here and now. If not, his smile sharpened. Then perhaps the world will see the truth. The host turned expectantly. The audience hushed. Cameras zoomed in, catching every bead of sweat on Caleb's brow. Caleb stood slowly, walking to the board. His heart pounded, but his steps were steady. He stared at the sprawl of symbols, letting his mind adjust, searching for the rhythm beneath the noise. Milton crossed his arms, watching, his expression smug. He expected hesitation, confusion, collapse. He expected vindication. But Caleb saw it. The path opened in his mind, the same way it had in the lecture hall. The noise untangled, the structure emerged, and the beauty of the problem revealed itself. He picked up the marker, and then his hand moved. The audience leaned forward as the first line appeared. Then the second. His logic flowed, faster than the cameras could keep up. The cameraman struggled, zooming out, trying to follow the pace of Caleb's strokes. Line after line, transformation after transformation, the impossible equation shrank beneath his hand. His movements were fluid, confident, as though he'd known the solution all along. Murmurs filled the room. He's doing it again. This can't be real. Look at the speed. Milton's face drained of color. His smugness cracked into disbelief, then fear. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing, searching for a flaw, but there was none. Each step was airtight, undeniable. The final transformation fell into place. Caleb set the marker down. The board was solved. For a heartbeat, the studio was silent. Then the audience erupted. Cheers, applause, shouts echoing through the space. The cameras caught it all, beaming it live to millions of households. Caleb stood calmly, his chest rising and falling. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat. He simply let the truth stand on the board for all to see. Milton, red-faced, sputtered. This proves nothing. He couldn't. The host cut him off. Professor, the cameras captured every step. There was no script, no notes, no outside help. This young man solved your equation live, in real time. The audience roared louder, some rising to their feet. Milton's shoulders sagged, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. Caleb finally turned, his eyes locking on Milton. His voice, though quiet, carried across the stage with cutting clarity. The real equation you can't solve. He paused, letting the silence sharpen, is racism. The words landed like a strike. The audience gasped, then exploded in applause, chants, cheers so loud the stage itself seemed to tremble. Milton stood frozen, humiliated, his face flushed under the merciless lights. Caleb lowered the microphone, his chest steady, his gaze unbroken. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just proving a solution, he was rewriting the problem. As the audience roared and Milton stood in stunned silence, Caleb's words echoed across the nation. The real equation you can't solve is racism. And with that, he became more than a student. He became a lightning rod. The night after the televised showdown, Caleb lay awake in his dorm room, staring at the ceiling as the echo of applause still rang in his ears. He had stood on national television, solved what no one else could, and called out racism in front of millions. He should have felt invincible. But his phone, buzzing on the nightstand, told a different story. At first, the notifications were praise, tweets celebrating him, messages from strangers thanking him for speaking truth to power. But as the hours passed, darker voices pushed their way in. "You're a fraud. Stay in your lane. We know where you live." The subject lines of emails turned sinister. Anonymous accounts filled his mentions with threats. Some messages carried venomous slurs. Others promised violence. His inbox, once a symbol of opportunity, now looked like a minefield. By morning, the weight of it settled into his chest. For the first time, he asked himself, was it worth it? The world had crowned him a genius, but fame felt like a double-edged blade, sharp enough to elevate him, sharp enough to cut him down. Every time he stepped outside, he felt eyes on him, some in awe, others in suspicion. He flinched at shadows, his mind replaying the threats he couldn't unsee. In class, whispers followed him. Some students treated him like a legend. Others avoided him altogether. He was no longer Caleb Richardson, the scholarship kid in the back row. He was Caleb Richardson, the headline. The anxiety clawed at him. Nights blurred into restless hours. Mornings began with dread. Even mathematics, the one thing that had always been pure, safe, untouchable, felt tainted. His notebook sat unopened on his desk, pages half filled with equations that no longer brought him peace. And yet, just as despair pressed hardest, letters began to arrive. Handwritten, folded carefully. Sent from across the country. He opened one and read, "Because of you, I believe in myself. They told me kids like me don't belong in science. You proved them wrong." Another, "I'm the only black girl in my engineering class. When they laugh at me, I think about you and I keep going." A third, "I used to think I was stupid. Now I know I'm not. I'm just overlooked. Thank you for showing me that." Caleb sat at his desk. Letter after letter spread before him like fragments of hope. For every threat, there was a voice of gratitude. For every insult, a spark of belief ignited in someone else. His mother noticed the change in his eyes as he read them. "See," she said softly, resting her hand on his shoulder. "You're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're carrying all of them too. And they're carrying you." Still, the fear lingered. One night as he walked back to his dorm, a car slowed beside him. He felt the hairs on his neck rise. The window rolled down. Voices jeered, words laced with hate. He braced for violence. But the car sped off with laughter, leaving him shaken in the cold. He returned to his room, heart racing, hands trembling as he locked the door behind him. The threats weren't abstract anymore. They were closing in. Marcus Holloway, his lawyer, urged him to take precautions. "Get security, stay off campus for a while. They won't forgive you for embarrassing Milton. Not after you turned him into a symbol of their failure." But Caleb shook his head. "If I leave, they win. If I hide, every kid writing me those letters will think you can't fight back. I have to stay." Marcus studied him carefully. "Brilliance is dangerous, Caleb, especially when it shines where they don't want it to." The words lingered. Brilliance was dangerous. And Caleb was beginning to wonder if he had unleashed something even he couldn't control. Weeks passed. The protests faded. The headlines shifted. But Caleb's name never fully left the public eye. He was a reminder, a challenge, a scar the institution couldn't heal over. And then one evening, as the sun dipped low behind campus towers, an email arrived in his inbox. It wasn't like the others. No threats, no praise. Just a simple subject line, opportunity. The sender, a recruiter for Helios Technologies, a Silicon Valley giant known for breakthroughs in artificial intelligence and cutting-edge research. The message was short, but electrifying. "We've been following your story. We believe your mind is extraordinary. Helios would like to meet with you to discuss a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, full funding for your projects, unlimited resources, protection, a future where your brilliance won't just survive, it will lead." Caleb read it twice, then a third time. His pulse quickened. Protection, resources, a future. The words felt like water in a desert. But beneath the promise, A question gnawed at him. What would they ask in return? He closed his laptop slowly, staring into the dim light of his dorm room. The letters from students lay scattered on his desk, their inked words whispering courage. The threats still filled his inbox, pulsing like poison. And now this offer dangled before him. A chance to escape, to rise, to be untouchable. Caleb pressed his palms together, torn between fear and hope, silence and voice. The choice that awaited him would not be about math. It would be about truth. Caleb stared at the offer glowing on his screen, his heart caught between safety and sacrifice. Helios Technologies promised him the world, but at what cost? The storm after the televised showdown was unlike anything Caleb had ever imagined. His name wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. Clips of him dismantling Milton's challenge looped across news channels, social media, and late-night comedy shows. Memes painted him as a hero. Quotes from his final line, "The real equation you can't solve is racism," plastered on posters, tweets, even protest banners. But with fame came pressure. Caleb's inbox overflowed with speaking requests, sponsorship deals, even marriage proposals from strangers. His phone buzzed endlessly, drowning him in noise. At first he ignored most of it, clinging to his notebooks, as though solving equations could anchor him back to normalcy. But normal had slipped through his fingers the moment Milton's equation met his chalk. Then came the meeting request from a global tech giant, Synchronet Systems. The email was polished, professional, lined with promises. "We admire your brilliance. We'd like to discuss opportunities that could secure your future." Marcus urged caution, but Caleb's mother insisted he at least hear them out. "Not every door opens twice," she reminded him. And so, 1 week later, Caleb found himself stepping into Synchronet's towering glass headquarters, where the lobby gleamed like wealth itself. Executives in sleek suits ushered him into a private boardroom, offering bottled water with labels he couldn't even pronounce. The CEO, Daniel Kerrigan, shook his hand firmly, his smile practiced yet warm. "Caleb," Kerrigan said, gesturing toward the head seat at the table. "You're extraordinary. We want you on our team." Caleb sat, his palms damp, his heart heavy. "Doing what?" "Research. Innovation. Leading projects most people your age can't even dream of. We'll fund your work, give you resources you've never had access to." Kerrigan's smile sharpened. "And of course compensate you generously. A 6-figure salary, housing, protection." Protection. The word stuck. But then came the fine print, delivered smoothly, almost as an afterthought. "In return, we'll need you to step away from the activism," Kerrigan continued. "The protests, the interviews, the rhetoric about race, it distracts from your brilliance. Here you'll be safe, respected, untouchable. All we ask is silence." Silence. The room felt colder. Caleb's throat tightened. "So, you want me to bury what happened? Pretend it didn't matter?" Kerrigan spread his hands. "What happened was unfortunate. But if you focus on it, you'll always be defined by it. Focus on what you can do, your talent, your future. Don't waste it fighting battles you can't win." The words echoed, Milton's in disguise. "Respect the boundaries of your abilities. Stay in your lane." Caleb's chest burned. Marcus, sitting beside him as counsel, leaned forward. "Let me be clear," he said evenly. "What you're asking is for him to trade truth for comfort, to accept a golden cage." Kerrigan didn't flinch. "I'm asking him to secure his future, to stop letting himself be used as a pawn in a political game. He has genius. Why waste it shouting at walls when he could be changing the world through innovation?" Caleb sat in silence, the weight of the offer pressing on him. 6 figures, safety, respect, all the things he had never been given, now laid out on the table like bait. But then he saw his mother in his mind, her weary hands clutching grocery bags, her quiet prayers in hospital waiting rooms, her voice steady even when her body shook with exhaustion. He thought of the 12-year-old boy stealing bread so she wouldn't go hungry. He thought of every teacher who doubted him, every classmate who mocked him, every professor who erased him. And he thought of the students outside marching in his name, their voices hoarse from chanting, "Justice for Caleb." He turned to his mother, who had joined him for the meeting, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She looked at him with eyes that carried years of sacrifice, eyes that had never once stopped believing. "You were born to solve harder problems than math," she whispered. Caleb exhaled, the decision settling like steel inside him. He turned back to Kerrigan. I'm grateful for the offer, but I can't accept it. Kerrigan blinked. You can't. My silence, Caleb interrupted, wouldn't just bury my story. It would bury every kid who looks like me. Every kid who's told they don't belong in classrooms, in labs, in boardrooms. I won't be part of that. The room chilled. Kerrigan's smile evaporated, his face tightening. You're making a mistake, Caleb. Opportunities like this don't come twice. Caleb stood, steady, unshaken. Neither does a chance to change the world. The meeting ended abruptly. No handshakes, no smiles, just cold stares as Caleb walked out with Marcus and his mother at his side. Outside, cameras waited, questions flying like arrows. For once, Caleb didn't shrink from them. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. I was offered money, safety, a future, he said into the microphones. But only if I stayed silent. Only if I pretended racism didn't matter. I won't accept that, because the real work isn't just solving equations, it's solving the injustice that keeps kids like me from even stepping into the room. The crowd roared, chants rising again, louder than before. And then Caleb dropped the final revelation, his voice firm, resolute. That's why I'm starting a foundation, one that will fund, mentor, and protect underprivileged Black students in STEM. Because no one should have to steal bread at 12 and still be doubted at 19, just to prove they're worthy of learning. The crowd erupted, reporters shouting, cameras flashing. But Milton, watching the broadcast from his office, slammed his fist on the desk. Caleb wasn't just surviving, he was building an army. As cheers thundered outside, Caleb announced his new foundation. But in the shadows, Milton's rage deepened. Because Caleb's fight had grown far beyond him, and now it threatened everything he stood for. The years that followed were not easy. Change never was. But Caleb Richardson learned that persistence was a kind of genius too. The kind that didn't always solve equations on a blackboard, but rewrote the equations of life itself. His foundation, the Richardson Initiative for Black Scholars in STEM, started humbly, with a single scholarship and mentorship program. But momentum grew. The story of the boy who solved the impossible equation and refused to be silenced became a rallying cry. Donors, activists, educators, and corporations, the ones unafraid of uncomfortable truths, poured resources into the mission. Within 5 years, hundreds of students had gone through the program. Students who, like Caleb once was, were told they didn't belong. Students who carried brilliance inside them, but lacked the keys to open the right doors. Within a decade, it wasn't just hundreds. It was thousands. Caleb's foundation funded labs in underfunded schools, created summer programs for kids who had never seen themselves in science, and offered legal protections for students who, like him, were punished, not for failing, but for daring to succeed. He had become what he once resisted, a symbol. But this time, it wasn't a burden. It was a purpose. Meanwhile, Professor Milton's legacy unraveled quietly. At first, the university shielded him, refusing to admit fault. But the internet never forgot. The video of Caleb's proof still circulated, replayed on anniversaries, dissected in documentaries, celebrated in classrooms. And Milton's words, "Even broken clocks are right twice a day," became infamous, quoted as shorthand for institutional racism in academia. Donors began to ask questions. Enrollment slipped. The university's reputation cracked. Eventually, Milton was offered early retirement. Official statements called it a transition. Everyone else knew it was exile. His name, once revered, now carried an asterisk. He became a cautionary tale of what happens when pride collides with prejudice and loses. But Caleb did not gloat. He didn't need to. The work spoke louder than revenge ever could. And one day, years after the night he first picked up the chalk in that lecture hall, Caleb walked back into the same building. The classroom hadn't changed much. Rows of seats, the same polished floors, the same massive blackboard stretching across the wall. But this time, Caleb wasn't in the back row. He wasn't the invisible student waiting for permission to be seen. He was at the front. The chalk felt familiar in his hand as he wrote across the board, his movements slower now, not because he hesitated, but because he wanted each stroke to carry weight. The equation he wrote wasn't Milton's. It was simpler, cleaner, but still powerful. When he finished, he turned to the students filling the seats. Young faces, diverse, eager, some leaning forward in anticipation, some looking uncertain the way he once had. He let the silence linger, then spoke. "No mind is impossible," Caleb said softly. "Only the limits people put on us. The words carried through the room, not loud, but heavy with truth. He saw himself in their eyes, the quiet ones at the back, the ones who felt invisible, the ones whose brilliance was mistaken for luck, the ones already fighting battles they didn't choose. He wanted them to know that their equations, however difficult, were solvable. The students began to scribble notes, but Caleb paused, raising a hand. Don't just write it down. Ask yourself why it matters. Because the hardest problems aren't always numbers. Sometimes they're the walls people build around us, and those walls are meant to be solved too. The class stayed silent, listening, absorbing. For once, no one dismissed, no one mocked, no one erased. And as Caleb stood there, he felt the full circle close. He had once been the boy in the back row, dismissed, doubted, erased. Now he was the man at the front, rewriting not just equations, but future. His mother, sitting quietly in the corner of the room, smiled through tears. She had lived long enough to see her son not just survive, but transform the world that once tried to break him. Caleb picked up the chalk again, underlining the final line on the board. He looked back at the class, his voice calm, steady, but charged with challenge. The question is not whether you can solve this, he said. The question is, what equations of injustice will you solve? The students exchanged glances, some wide-eyed, some determined, as though the weight of the question had already begun to settle on their shoulders. Caleb set the chalk down, his hand steady, and then, with a final glance at the rows of faces staring back at him, he left them with words that had once saved him in the darkest of moments. The next answer, he said quietly, might be in your hands. The class sat frozen, the echo of Caleb's words hanging in the air. Outside the window, the world moved on, full of its own unsolved problems. And somewhere in that silence, in one of those young minds, the next solution was already beginning to take shape. Stories like Caleb's are not just stories, they're mirrors. They show us the brilliance the world tries to bury, and the silence it uses to keep injustice alive. But silence is a choice. If you believe voices like his deserve to be heard, type yes if you believe in justice, and subscribe if this broke your heart.